Could the discovery of her lost tomb finally rewrite everything we thought we knew about the queen who defied an empire?
Shadow our chief.
Alexandria, 31 BCE. A salt-stained wind whipped across the harbor, filling the city with the scent of brine and oil. Columns of white stone shimmered in the dying light, and the great Pharaoh's lighthouse, one of the wonders of the world, cast its beacon across a restless sea. Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt and goddess to her people, stood at the edge of her palace balcony, watching the crimson sails of her warships retreat beyond the horizon. Antony had gone to war. It was not the first time her lover, her Roman general, had sailed off to challenge Octavian, but this time felt final. Rome itself was splintering, two titans hurtling toward each other with nations at their backs. And Egypt, though rich, was isolated, ancient, and increasingly outmatched. Behind Cleopatra, the palace thrummed with gold and anxiety. The walls were painted with stars and jackals, echoing the gods of old. Incense curled in shadowy alcoves, and the corridors whispered with eunuchs and spies. She had ruled this palace since she was 18, co-ruler with her brothers, until poison and steel removed them. Now she stood alone, or nearly. In the chamber behind her, scrolls lay open, military reports from Syria, dispatches from spies in Rome, coded messages in Greek and Demotic. Octavian was not merely advancing, he was reshaping the very idea of Rome. His propaganda painted Antony as bewitched, a slave to the serpent of the Nile. And Cleopatra? A foreign seductress, corrupting Roman virtue with her perfume and silken beds. The accusations stung, but they were also dangerous. Octavian wasn't merely planning a war. He was planning a justification. Downstairs, in the palace court, her children played under watchful eyes. Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, her twins by Antony and young Ptolemy Philadelphus. They carried both Egyptian and Roman blood, a symbol of unity, or a reason for extermination, depending on who would win. Cleopatra turned away from the sea. The time for alliances was ending. The time for survival had begun. In the days that followed, the queen rarely slept. She met with priests, generals, and traders from as far as Nubia and Bactria. Gold was smuggled from temple vaults. Ships were burned to deny them to the enemy. Food stores were hoarded beneath the city. She knew that if Antony lost the coming battle at Actium, Egypt would stand alone against a world already surrendered to Rome. But Cleopatra had faced impossible odds before. She had returned from exile at the age of 21, smuggled past Roman blockades inside a rug to confront Julius Caesar. She had navigated palace coups, civil wars, and deadly Roman politics, outlasting every sibling and rival. Her mind was sharp, her charisma legendary. Even her enemies described her presence as a knife behind perfume. And now, as the full moon rose over Alexandria's white roofs, Cleopatra summoned her scribes. If she was to fall, history would not forget her version of the truth. She dictated a decree, framed in gold. If Egypt must be taken, let it be a tomb. Let the treasures of the Ptolemies burn before they are paraded in chains. The queen had made her decision. A year earlier, September, 31 BCE. The Ionian Sea shimmered with unnatural stillness. The Roman fleet, under Octavian's ruthless admiral Agrippa, spread across the horizon like an iron wall. Anchored at the mouth of the Ambracian Gulf, the fleet of Antony and Cleopatra was trapped, pinned between sea and hostile shores. Cleopatra's flagship, a behemoth of cedar and bronze with crimson sails, stood out among the vessels. It was not a warship by traditional design. It was a floating palace, complete with oarsmen, soldiers, servants, and a throne. But it also held Cleopatra's most potent weapon, a treasury of Egyptian gold, enough to shift the course of war or pay for a hasty escape. Below decks, the smell of pitch and sweat lingered. Above, Cleopatra watched from her carved stern deck, surrounded by Egyptian guards with leopard skin cloaks and curved khopesh swords. Around her, Antony's fleet struggled with disunity, commanders arguing, supplies dwindling, morale crumbling. And every day, more ships defected to Octavian's side. The queen saw it in Antony's face. The haunted eyes, the tremor in his jaw. This was not the same man who had once conquered Parthia and ruled half the known world. Rome had turned on him. His legions doubted him, and now he faced the impossible. Escape a blockade, defeat a superior navy, and reclaim his honor, all with Cleopatra's fortune in his hold. At dawn, the sea exploded into war. Octavian's fleet advanced with surgical precision, ramming and boarding. Antony's heavier ships tried to break the line, but they moved like lumbering beasts. Fires broke out on both sides, sails tore, men screamed in Greek and Latin. Cleopatra's ship held back, guarded by elite marines, its true mission not to fight, but to survive. Then came the signal. A flash of mirrored sunlight from Antony's command tower. Cleopatra gave the order. Her ship, along with a dozen others, broke formation and slipped south, oars churning furiously. A pre-planned escape, a calculated betrayal, or a desperate act of self-preservation. Antony, seeing her crimson sails fading on the horizon, did the unthinkable. He abandoned the battle. Historians would debate it for centuries. Was he bewitched by Cleopatra or simply broken? Whatever the truth, his desertion shattered his fleet. Commanders surrendered, ships burned, bodies floated in oil-slick waters as Octavian seized victory. By nightfall, the Gulf of Actium was silent. And Cleopatra's fleet, though diminished, had vanished into the Mediterranean mist. Back in Alexandria, months later, the palace prepared for siege. Cleopatra returned with what remained of her navy, and with Antony, whose pride had shattered alongside his reputation. He grew erratic, avoiding court, issuing erratic orders, drinking heavily. Whispers spread among the palace guards. Antony was haunted. Some nights he screamed in Latin at ghosts only he could see. Cleopatra, meanwhile, resumed control. She fortified the city's walls, reforged alliances with desert tribes, moved treasures from temples to hidden caches beneath the Library of Alexandria. But she also began to prepare something else, something few knew about. In the deepest vault of the palace, behind obsidian doors guarded by Nubian mercenaries, Cleopatra began assembling what she called the final chamber. If Octavian breached the city, if she were to be captured, she would not be paraded in chains through Rome. No pharaoh would suffer such humiliation. Inside that chamber, guarded by death traps, sacred relics, and possibly poison, lay her last contingency. But even then, she did not surrender to fate. Late into the night, Cleopatra met with scholars, mystics, and spies. She requested maps of Hispania and India, corresponded secretly with Parthian envoys. Somewhere, out there, a path must still exist, not to defeat Octavian, but to vanish beyond his reach. Still, every hour brought the enemy closer. And inside the palace, a shadow deepened. Antony, once her greatest shield, was now her greatest risk. Winter bled into spring. Alexandria, once the jewel of the Mediterranean, now braced like a clenched fist. The great harbor, once teeming with Greek triremes and Egyptian barges, was eerily silent. Traders had fled, foreign embassies had closed their doors. Even the famed library, where scrolls had once been copied by candlelight day and night, now stored grain and weaponry. Inside the royal palace, the balance of power fractured. Antony moved like a ghost, his once mighty presence reduced to a hunched silhouette wandering the marbled halls. Gone were the laurels and armor, replaced by a threadbare cloak and glazed eyes. Some days he summoned his officers and spoke of new plans, impossible offensives, phantom legions. Other days, he disappeared into the lower levels of the palace, where few dared to follow. Cleopatra watched this decay with a mixture of sorrow and strategy. She had loved Antony, not as a tool, but as a man who, like her, had dared to challenge the order of empires. But now, she saw the trap tightening. Octavian would arrive soon, and Antony's name was poison. To be tied to him was to be condemned, and yet to abandon him might fracture the last loyalties she held. In secret, she began a parallel operation. Trusted servants were dispatched under false identities. Ancient escape tunnels, rumored to lead beneath the palace and into the necropolis, were cleared. Scrolls of ancient poisons were unsealed, compiled by generations of Ptolemaic priests. Vials were tested on condemned criminals in the lower dungeons. Cleopatra would not leave her fate to Octavian's mercy. If she could not win, she would control the end. But even as she planned for death, she plotted for life. She sent envoys to Indian kingdoms, offering gold and wisdom in exchange for sanctuary. She wrote to the Nubian kings, recalling old alliances sealed with blood and coin. And she began drafting a final decree. Her children, especially Cleopatra Selene, were to be hidden if the city fell. One branch of her bloodline must endure. And yet, the siege never came, only silence. Octavian's legions advanced slowly, methodically, disarming cities without bloodshed, turning allies with bribes and propaganda. He did not march like a conqueror, he absorbed. His war was not just of steel, but of perception. Across the known world, his version of history was already being written. By the time his fleet reached Alexandria's harbor, many within the city had already turned. The gates did not resist. Antony awoke one morning to find his guards gone. In a panic, he rushed to the palace tower, gazing across the sea. Octavian's standards now fluttered from ships anchored just outside the harbor. The city had not fallen, it had opened its arms. And somewhere in the lower palace, a false report reached his ears: Cleopatra was dead. Taken her own life to avoid capture. Something inside Antony shattered. Racing through the palace, he found no trace of her. Only silence. He staggered into the chamber where they had once dined beside fountains of rosewater, now emptied of servants and joy. Alone and broken, he fell upon his own sword. Roman style, the final honor of a defeated general. But he did not die. The blade missed his heart. He was still bleeding when Cleopatra's guards found him, dragged him, gasping, through corridors now echoing with Roman boots. He begged for death. Instead, he was brought to her. The queen was not dead. She stood in her private chamber, veiled in linen and gold, her face unreadable. She looked down at the man who had once defied Caesar, who had once promised her a world forged by their union, and now lay crumpled at her feet like a broken statue. She knelt, kissed his forehead, and whispered something history never recorded. He died minutes later. Outside the city, Octavian waited. He had not come as a conqueror. He had come to collect. The queen had one move left. Alexandria's skyline stood mute beneath the weight of Roman banners. Octavian entered the city not as a marauder but as a ruler in waiting, his soldiers disciplined, his demeanor coldly ceremonial. To the people, he proclaimed peace. To the court, he extended offers of mercy. But to Cleopatra, he sent a message of containment. She would not leave the palace. Not yet. He knew her death would make her a martyr. He needed her alive, long enough to parade her through Rome in triumph, chained in gold, her head bowed beneath the roar of the mob. But Cleopatra had already begun writing her own finale. Within the innermost sanctum of the palace, deep beyond colonnades, behind carved panels that only opened at her touch, lay the final chamber. The room pulsed with a silence so complete it seemed alive. Its walls bore the painted gods of her ancestors: Isis, Anubis, Horus, Osiris, all standing witness to the queen's final ritual. 3 handmaidens remained with her: Iris, Charmian, and a mute Nubian priestess whose name had been lost to record. Together, they prepared the chamber with oils, herbs, and funerary linens. Cleopatra dressed not as a Romanized monarch, but as the living embodiment of Isis. Her robes shimmered with lapis and gold. Her headdress bore the sun disk and cobra of divine royalty. Before her, a low altar glowed with coals. Upon it sat a basket, sealed, silent, and still. Octavian, unaware of the preparations, sent word demanding an audience. He offered her safety, even comfort, if she would surrender. But Cleopatra knew the theater of Roman victory. She knew the fate of other captured monarchs, led in chains, mocked, then quietly executed once the crowds dispersed. She had seen her own sister Arsinoe dragged through the streets of Rome. She would not follow her. That morning, she penned one final letter. A Roman courier delivered it to Octavian. It read simply, "I have lived as queen. I shall die as such." Alarmed, Octavian dispatched guards to the palace. They arrived too late. Inside the final chamber, a ritual was already unfolding. The air was thick with incense and crushed lotus petals. Cleopatra stood beneath a carved lintel bearing the names of her ancestors, Ptolemy XII, Alexander the Great, and further back, to pharaohs whose tombs now lay half buried in sand. Iris and Charmian draped her in linen. The priestess chanted words older than the city itself. And then, from the basket, came the soft, deliberate rustle of movement. Accounts diverge here. Roman historians, eager to discredit her, claim she allowed a venomous asp to bite her breast. Others spoke of a poison concealed in a hairpin, or a concoction of herbs perfected in temple crypts. One account whispered that it was not the asp itself, but a venom-soaked blade hidden within the basket's lining. What is known as this? When Octavian's men broke into the chamber, they found the queen lying upon a gilded couch, flanked by Iris and Charmian. All three were dead, or nearly so. Charmian, gasping her last breath, was said to have straightened Cleopatra's crown before collapsing beside her. Octavian stood above them, victorious, and yet denied his prize. No chains, no triumph, no spectacle. Only silence. The Queen of Egypt, the last pharaoh of an unbroken lineage stretching back 3 millennia, was dead. Rome would consume her kingdom. Her children would be taken, some killed, others paraded, and one, Cleopatra Selene, would vanish into history, a daughter of 2 worlds. The tomb of Cleopatra was sealed, its location lost to time. But the story does not end there. Centuries later, rumors would echo from beneath the silt and ruins of Alexandria. Divers swore they saw walls carved with hieroglyphs beneath the harbor. Villagers whispered of curses and chambers sealed with molten lead. Scholars argued that Cleopatra's tomb was built not within the city, but beneath a temple of Isis outside of time's reach. And still today, the search continues, for the tomb, for the truth, for the queen who chose her end, and denied Rome its final humiliation. Octavian stood before the golden couch, the scent of myrrh and death curling in the air. Cleopatra's body had already begun to cool, her final expression frozen in defiance. For all his victories, all his calculations, he realized then that he had been outmaneuvered in the final move. The queen had denied him the one thing he could not command, her image. But he would have the last word. The Roman machine spun quickly into motion. Cleopatra's body was embalmed with care, placed beside Antony's in a tomb she had commissioned long before. Though Octavian allowed their burial rites to be honored, he stripped them of grandeur. The tomb's location, never publicly marked, faded into the sand and sea. Back in Rome, Octavian, soon to become Augustus, crafted the narrative. He told the Senate and the people that Cleopatra was no divine queen, but a corrupting force, a foreign temptress who had ensnared Roman virtue and nearly destroyed it. In monuments and histories, she was reduced to caricature, the wicked seductress, the exotic distraction. Her intelligence, her rule, her power, buried beneath propaganda. It was the final assassination of memory. But across the ancient world, another legacy lingered. Cleopatra's daughter, Cleopatra Selene, was taken to Rome. She walked in Octavian's triumph, paraded as spoils of war, but she survived. Raised in the household of Octavia, Antony's Roman wife, Selene was educated in both Latin and Greek, trained in diplomacy and courtly cunning. And when she came of age, Augustus gave her in marriage to King Juba II of Mauritania, a strategic alliance cloaked in reward. But Cleopatra Selene did not forget. In her new kingdom, she infused the architecture with Egyptian flourishes. She founded cities, libraries, and temples, echoing her mother's vision of civilization. Coins were minted bearing her image. And in those coins, she wore not the modest veil of a Roman matron, but the sun disk and serpent crown of Isis. Through her, Cleopatra's line endured. In Egypt, centuries passed. The temples fell, the Nile shifted, the sands reclaimed what marble could not resist. Yet the myth of Cleopatra only grew. Christian scribes demonized her, Arab historians wondered at her lost knowledge. Renaissance thinkers romanticized her, Shakespeare immortalized her in verse. But the truth, layered in smoke, politics, and stolen glory, remained elusive. Where was her tomb? Had it collapsed into the sea during an earthquake, as some claimed? Was it buried beneath modern Alexandria, under alleys and cathedrals? Or was it, as whispered in esoteric texts, hidden in the sacred precinct of Taposiris Magna, a temple of Isis 45 kilometers from the ancient capital? There, some believe, Cleopatra rests still, wrapped in linen, crowned with gold, beside the man for whom she defied an empire. If the tomb is ever found, it would not merely reveal her bones, it would shatter centuries of imperial lies. It would restore the image of a queen who ruled not by beauty alone, but by brilliance, resolve, and a terrifying mastery of fate. In the end, Cleopatra won something even Rome could not touch. Immortality. Not in chains. Not in triumph. But in legend. The centuries after Cleopatra's death brought more than Roman emperors, they brought forgetting. Alexandria, once the cradle of learning, declined under Roman rule. Earthquakes cracked its foundations, fires devoured its famed library, and with each conquest, from Byzantines to Arabs to Ottomans, Cleopatra's story blurred further, her memory torn between myth and monument. But something lingered. In ancient scrolls and whispered traditions, the tomb of the Pharaoh queen remained a tantalizing enigma. Roman chroniclers claimed it stood near the temple of Isis. Others insisted it was beneath the waves, toppled by a great tremor in the 4th century. Still more whispered of underground chambers protected by curses, sealed by locks only gods could undo. By the Middle Ages, Arab historians recorded tales of a golden queen, buried beneath the earth near the Great Lake of Marut. Local Bedouins spoke of carved tunnels too dangerous to enter, where lamps burned without flame and walls bled salt. Even Napoleon's scholars, during his campaign in Egypt, noted references to a city of the dead beneath the sands west of Alexandria. The tomb refused to speak. Yet the legend grew louder. In the early 21st century, archaeologists turned serious eyes to Taposiris Magna, the temple ruins west of Alexandria. Carved in Greek and hieroglyphs, the temple was dedicated to Isis, the very goddess Cleopatra had invoked in her final hours. What they found was staggering. Beneath the temple lay tunnels and burial shafts untouched for 2 millennia. Coins bearing Cleopatra's image, statues carved in her likeness, crypts sealed with stone and silence. And yet, no tomb. No body, no sarcophagus, no chamber that screamed, "Here lies the last pharaoh." It was as if Cleopatra, even in death, had erased her trail. Some now believe this was her final act of power, not merely to die, but to vanish. To deny history its closure. To become more than a woman. To become a myth. But myths have a pulse. And in the dust of forgotten chambers, something still waits. The year is 2025. In a desert trench west of Alexandria, the sun bleeds across the ruins of Taposiris Magna. Modern machines hum where priests once chanted. Archaeologists, armored in sunscreen and silence, descend into the earth, seeking the unthinkable. They believe Cleopatra is here. Not in Rome's imagination, not in Shakespeare's lines, but in stone, in bone, in silence. They have reason to hope. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed a network of chambers beneath the temple, sealed since the 1st century BCE. Black limestone blocks form a labyrinth of tunnels, some flooded, some collapsed. Inscriptions refer to the House of the Two Lovers, the burial of the reborn sun, and Isis in flesh, epithets long linked to Cleopatra. In one sealed vault, opened only months ago, a mural was discovered, faint, flaking, but unmistakable. It shows a woman wearing the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, standing beside a Roman general, both receiving blessings from Isis and Osiris. The likeness is unmistakable. Cleopatra and Antony, rendered in divine form. Was it decoration? Or was it direction? Deeper still, beneath a level never breached before, lies a single sealed chamber. Its entrance framed by granite and gold leaf, locked by ancient stone pins. Within, magnetic resonance suggests a large, central object, metallic outlines surrounded by smaller artifacts. Some believe it to be a sarcophagus, untouched for 2,000 years. But permission to open it has not been granted. Not yet. The Egyptian government hesitates, fearing a media circus. Others whisper darker concerns, of ancient protections, of political unrest, of secrets meant to stay buried. Even now, in the age of satellites and science, Cleopatra holds the world in suspense. Just as she always did. Some say the tomb should remain sealed. That Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, chose her own death, chose her obscurity, and that to break into her sanctuary is to undo her final act of power. Others argue that the world needs her story, her truth, to show that she was not merely a seductress, nor a symbol, but a sovereign queen who defied the greatest empire on earth. And if the chamber is ever opened, the world may find not just a tomb, but a confrontation with the past. With ambition. With empire. With a woman who carved her name into time, and then hid it beneath stone. She ruled as a goddess. She died as a queen. She lives as a legend. And somewhere beneath the dust of Egypt, she waits. Beneath the surface of history lies a truth harder to excavate than any tomb: perception. For 2 millennia, Cleopatra's image has morphed like a shadow cast through fog. Each era forged its own mirror to reflect her, not who she was, but what they needed her to be. The Romans made her a cautionary tale, seductive, manipulative, foreign. The medieval world erased her entirely, or cast her as a sorceress. The Renaissance reimagined her as a tragic beauty, an Eve of empire. Hollywood dressed her in jewels and eyeliner, then gave her Elizabeth Taylor's voice. But strip away the fiction, the venom, the velvet curtains, and what remains? A woman who inherited a dying empire at 18. A ruler who mastered 9 languages, debated philosophers, negotiated with generals. A strategist who navigated 2 of history's most dangerous men, and survived them both longer than most of their peers. A queen who fought not for love, but for sovereignty, hers, and Egypt's. Cleopatra knew the power of image. She minted her own coins, posed as Isis, and used beauty not as seduction, but as symbol, an ancient language of legitimacy. And when the world tried to trap her in a story, she rewrote the ending. Not with a flourish of tragedy, but with silence, disappearance, control. So perhaps her tomb was never meant to be found. Perhaps the real burial was not of a body, but of the truth itself. She is not just Cleopatra. She is the last breath of pharaonic Egypt. The echo of Hellenistic glory. The woman who stood at the crossroads of 2 civilizations, and refused to kneel. And even now, when archaeologists dig and cameras wait and the world holds its breath at every discovery, it is still she who holds the power. Still she who decides what we know. Still she who stares back through time, from the mirror of history, asking, "Do you see me yet?"